The ballroom smelled like champagne and cruelty. Mei Lin stood at the edge of the marble staircase, fingers wrapped around a crystal glass she hadn't touched, watching her husband laugh with people who had never once looked at her with anything other than barely concealed disgust. The chandelier above her head dripped with 10,000 lights, and every single one of them felt like a spotlight on everything she was supposed to be ashamed of. Her gown was expensive. Kai Ren had made sure of that, not out of love, but because a poorly dressed wife reflected badly on him in public. The fabric was deep burgundy, tailored carefully around the body he mocked behind closed doors, the body he had chosen, the body he had decided to make his punchline. She took a slow breath and reminded herself to smile. That was the job. Smile. Stand still, don't eat too much at dinner, don't laugh too loudly, don't exist too fully in any space where his important friends might notice her and find her lacking. Mei Lin had become so good at shrinking herself emotionally that sometimes she forgot she had once been a woman who took up space without apology, who laughed from her belly, who believed without question that she deserved to be loved. That woman felt like someone she had read about in a book a long time ago. "You're blocking the view." Kai Ren appeared at her side without warning, his voice low and pleasant, the particular tone he used when he wanted to wound her without witnesses. He was handsome in the way that sharp things were handsome, dangerous at every angle, beautiful only until he got close enough to cut. He straightened his cufflink without looking at her. "Try to look less miserable. You're embarrassing me." "I'm fine," she said quietly. "You're standing there looking like a sad balloon that someone forgot to throw away." He smiled at a passing colleague, nodding smoothly before returning his attention to her with eyes that held nothing warm. "Go find somewhere to sit, preferably somewhere people aren't looking." Mei Lin set her untouched glass on the tray of a passing waiter and walked away from him without another word. She had learned that responses only extended the conversation, and extended conversations with Kai Ren in public always ended with her feeling smaller than when they began. She moved through the crowd with her head held at the precise angle she had practiced, not high enough to seem arrogant, not low enough to invite pity, and found a quiet corner near the tall windows that overlooked the city. Seoul glittered below her like a fallen constellation. She pressed her fingers gently against the cold glass and looked out at all those lights and thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, before Kai Ren had asked her to marry him in front of everyone at her workplace, a proposal so public and so sudden that she had said yes before her heart had the chance to ask the right questions. She had been a nurse then, pediatric ward, 3rd floor, the unit where children came in frightened and left with drawings taped to the walls and nurses who remembered their names. She had loved that work with everything she had. She had been good at it, genuinely, deeply good, in the way that only people who are called to something can be good at it. Kai Ren had made her quit within 4 months of the wedding. "A wife of mine doesn't work in a hospital," he had said, as though the sentence were self-explanatory. "You'll focus on the home." The home she focused on became a silent, beautiful prison with heated floors and fresh flowers delivered every Monday, and a husband who came and went like weather, unpredictable and damaging, and completely indifferent to what he left behind. She didn't hear the conversation, not at first. The voices came from the other side of the thick velvet drape to her left, 2 men speaking in the low, comfortable way of people who believed they were completely alone. The first voice she recognized immediately. It belonged to Shin, Kai Ren's oldest friend, a man with a wide smile and eyes that were always calculating something. "So how long are you keeping this up?" Shin asked. "As long as it takes," Kai Ren's voice, lazy, amused. "The original bet was 1 year. And I'll collect at 1 year. A pause, the sound of a glass being set down. "She has no idea. She thinks I actually wanted her." Mei Lin's hand went still against the window glass. "You're a special kind of cruel, you know that," Shin said, and he sounded more admiring than appalled. She was the easiest mark I've ever found, lonely, overlooked, desperate to be chosen. All I had to do was propose in public so she couldn't say no without humiliating herself. Kairen laughed softly. 5 million won says I can make her believe she's loved for a full year before I pull the floor out. Yoon doubled down and said I couldn't do it without her suspecting. I've already won. And then? And then I file for divorce, collect my money, and let her figure out the rest. Another pause. She'll probably eat herself to death. She's already halfway there. The laughter that followed was quiet and comfortable, and it moved through Mei Lin's body like a current of ice water, spreading from her chest outward until her fingers were numb against the glass and the lights of Seoul below her blurred into a single smear of gold. She stood completely still, because movement felt impossible, because her lungs had forgotten their rhythm, because 3 years of small cruelties and quiet erosions had just rearranged themselves into a shape she could finally see clearly, and the shape was this. None of it had ever been real. Not the proposal, not the wedding, not the single moment when she had looked at him across a candlelit table in their first month of marriage and thought, maybe this is enough. Maybe chosen is the same as loved. He had chosen her the way a hunter chooses a target. She stepped away from the window. She walked back through the ballroom with the same careful posture, the same measured expression, the face she had spent 3 years perfecting. She collected her coat from the attendant at the entrance. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, and stood watching the numbers descend with her hands folded in front of her and her breathing so controlled it barely moved her chest. She did not cry until she was in the back of the taxi with the privacy screen raised. Then she pressed both hands over her mouth and wept so hard her shoulders shook. Not just for tonight, not just for the bet, but for every morning she had woken up and tried harder, at less, spoken more carefully, made herself smaller and quieter and less, believing that if she just found the right combination, she would finally become someone he could love. She wept for the nurse she used to be, for the laugh she had buried, for the 3 years she would never recover. The taxi moved through the glittering city, and Mei Lin cried until she had nothing left. She didn't go home that night. She couldn't. The thought of walking back into that beautiful apartment, into the bed they shared, into the life he had constructed around her, like a stage for his own entertainment, her body refused it. She asked the driver to take her to the one place that had always made her feel like herself, even when she had forgotten who that was. Seoul General Hospital, Pediatric Ward, 3rd floor. She had friends there still, nurses who had sent careful texts over the years, who had never quite stopped checking on her even when she had slowly stopped being available to check on. The night shift supervisor, a small, fierce woman named Ji Yeon, found her sitting in the corridor outside the ward at 11:45 at night in a burgundy gown with ruined mascara, and said nothing at all, just brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her and waited. "I need to think," Mei Lin said. "Then think," Ji Yeon said simply. They sat together in the quiet corridor with the soft sounds of the ward around them, the gentle beeping of monitors, the distant murmur of a night nurse making rounds, the particular hushed quality of a children's hospital after dark that Mei Lin had always felt less like sadness and more like careful watching, like the whole building was holding its breath on behalf of the small lives inside it. It was nearly 1 in the morning when the emergency came through. The doors at the end of the corridor burst open, and the night erupted into controlled urgency, a journey moving fast, a trauma team surrounding it, voices clipped and precise. Mei Lin pressed herself against the wall as they passed and caught a single image in the chaos. A small boy, no older than 6, gray-faced and frighteningly still, one tiny hand hanging off the edge of the journey, with an IV already taped into the crook of his elbow. Behind the journey, barely contained by 2 security staff, was a man. Mei Lin noticed him the way you noticed a storm, not because you were looking for it, but because something in your body registered the pressure change before your mind caught up. He was tall, dressed in black, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, but from a fury so immense that it had turned inward and become something colder and more dangerous than rage. His face was a controlled mask, with a single crack in it. His eyes, fixed on the doors that had just swallowed his son, were the eyes of a man standing at the precise edge of something he could not survive. "Sir, you need to wait here," one of the security staff was saying. "I will wait where I choose," his voice said. Quiet and absolute, the security staff actually stepped back. Ji Yan appeared at Mei Lin's elbow. "Massive internal hemorrhage," she murmured, low and fast. "The boy needs a rare blood type transfusion immediately. AB negative. We're calling the bank now, but the wait—"
"I'm AB negative," Mei Lin said. Ji Yan looked at her. "I'm AB negative," she said again, already moving. "I'm a trained nurse. Get me to whoever is in charge." She didn't look at the man in black as she passed him. She was already focused on the doors, on the small, grey-faced boy on the other side of them, on the thing she had been trained to do and had been kept from doing for 3 years by a man who had never seen her value. Tonight, in a burgundy gown with dried tears on her face, Mei Lin walked back into the only version of herself that had never needed anyone's permission to exist. She never saw the man in black turn and watch her go through those doors. She never saw the expression that moved across his face, something that began as desperate gratitude and became, in the space of a single breath, something much more complicated and much more permanent. His name was Jun Wei, and he never forgot a debt. She gave his son's life back without knowing his name. He spent 2 years searching for hers, and when he finally found her, broken, betrayed, and abandoned, Jun Wei made a decision that would shake every powerful family in Seoul to its foundation. Some debts are paid with money, some are paid with protection, and some, the ones that matter most, are paid with everything. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. Kai Ren had always had a talent for timing his cruelties, not in the heat of anger, not in private where the damage could be contained, but in the specific calculated moments where the audience was large enough and the exit was far enough away that Mei Lin would have no choice but to absorb everything in full view of people whose opinions he had spent years teaching her to care about. It was a skill he had refined across 3 years of marriage, the way other men refined golf swings or investment strategies, with patience, with repetition, and with a quiet satisfaction that never fully showed on his face. The occasion was the annual gathering at the home of Director Lim, Kai Ren's immediate superior at Ren Capital Group, a sprawling house in the northern hills of Seoul, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a guest list of exactly the people who mattered in Kai Ren's professional world. 60 people, colleagues, investors, department heads, and their spouses. The kind of gathering where careers were quietly decided over canapes and where the social hierarchy expressed itself through who spoke to whom and for how long. Mei Lin had attended 4 of these in 3 years. She knew every face in the room. More importantly, every face in the room knew hers. She had worn ivory that evening, a simple, structured dress that Ji Yan had helped her choose 2 days after the ballroom, 2 days after the overheard conversation had rearranged her entire understanding of her own life. She hadn't told anyone what she had heard. She was still deciding what to do with the knowledge, still turning it over in her mind, the way you turned a stone in your hand before deciding whether to set it down or throw it. She had come tonight because not coming would have required an explanation she wasn't ready to give, and because some surviving instinct in her wanted witnesses to whatever was about to happen. She didn't know why she felt that, she simply did.
The gathering had been pleasant for exactly 90 minutes. She was standing near the kitchen island with Mrs. Lim and 2 other wives, listening to a conversation about a restaurant that had recently opened in Gangnam, when she felt the shift in the room, the way you felt a drop in air pressure before rain, a collective subtle redirection of attention, the particular silence that moved through a crowd when something was happening that everyone could see but nobody was certain how to react to yet. Mei Lin turned. Kai Ren had entered from the far hallway with his hand placed at the lower back of a woman Mei Lin had never seen before. She was beautiful in a precise, constructed way, sharp cheekbones, a dress that had been chosen to display rather than clothe, hair that moved with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the entrance. She was also visibly, unmistakably pregnant. The curve of her stomach was perhaps 5 months along, perhaps 6, and she wore it not with the quiet privacy of a woman still adjusting to her body's changes, but with the deliberate presentation of someone who understood exactly what statement it made in this room, in front of these people, standing beside this particular man. Kai Ren's eyes found Mei Lin's across the room immediately. He had known exactly where she was standing, he had timed the entrance to that knowledge, and the small smile that moved across his mouth when their eyes connected was the smile of a man collecting on a bet, unhurried, satisfied, slightly bored with how easy it had all been. There it is, Mei Lin thought, with a clarity that surprised her. There is the flaw he promised to pull out. She didn't move. She held Mrs. Lim's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, smiled at something she hadn't said, and turned back toward the kitchen island as though she needed to set down her glass. Her hands were completely steady. She noted this with a distant, almost academic interest. The steadiness of her hands, the evenness of her breathing, the fact that the ground beneath her felt solid when by every reasonable measure it should have felt like it was dissolving. Something had changed in her in the 48 hours since the ballroom. Something had hardened into place without Hauthomi noticing, the way a fracture in bone knits stronger than the original. She heard his footsteps before she heard his voice. Mei Lin. Kai Ren stopped 2 feet behind her, close enough for the room to observe, far enough to make the distance deliberate. She turned with the measured grace of a woman who had rehearsed composure for 3 years and found it had finally become genuine rather than performed. She looked at Kai Ren first, at the careful arrangement of his expression, the performance of discomfort that was actually the performance of a man enjoying himself, and then she looked at the woman beside him with eyes that were open and steady and gave nothing away. "This is Ying Yue," Kai Ren said. We've been together for some time now. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry you're finding out this way." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man reading from a script he had written himself and found adequately effective. Ying Yue looked at Mei Lin with the particular expression of a woman who had prepared for this moment and was disappointed to find her opponent so composed. She had expected tears, perhaps, raised voices, the satisfying collapse of the wife who wasn't enough. Instead, she found a woman in ivory looking back at her with dark, quiet eyes that gave her absolutely nothing to feed on. Ying Yue lifted her chin slightly and moved her hand to rest on the curve of her stomach, a gesture so deliberate that it was practically a spoken sentence. "I've heard about you," Ying Yue said softly. Her voice was warm and carefully calibrated, the voice of a woman performing graciousness while delivering injury. "Kai has told me so much." "I'm sure he has," Mei Lin said pleasantly. The room had gone very still in the particular way of 60 people pretending to continue their conversations while actually listening to every syllable of a single one. Mei Lin was aware of every set of eyes in her peripheral vision. She was aware of Mrs. Lim's frozen expression, of the way Director Lim had turned from the bar and gone quiet, of the two junior colleagues near the window who had stopped gesturing mid-sentence. Kairen reached into his jacket. He produced an envelope with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been holding it all evening and had been waiting for this exact configuration of audience and timing to deploy it. He held it out to Mei Lin between two fingers, the way you might offer something to someone you expected to flinch. My lawyer prepared these last week. I thought it was better to do this in person rather than through the mail. A pause, precisely weighted. I hope you understand. Mei Lin looked at the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment with her hands at her sides, and in that moment she was back in the corridor outside the pediatric ward, sitting with a cup of tea and the quiet sounds of the hospital around her. And she was in the taxi with her hands over her mouth, and she was standing at the ballroom window with the city glittering below her and the truth of 3 years rearranging itself into its true shape. She thought of the bet, she thought of the 5 million won, she thought of she'll probably eat herself to death. She thought of the nurse she had been, the woman who walked through emergency doors in a burgundy gown and given blood without knowing whose child she was saving and how far that single act would travel. She took the envelope. She opened it without hurry, unfolded the documents with steady hands, and read the first page with the focused attention of someone who had once been trained to read medical charts under pressure and had never entirely lost the skill. Divorce petition. Irreconcilable differences, asset division already determined, heavily and obviously in his favor, structured around a prenuptial agreement she had signed 3 years ago when she had still believed the man across from her was someone worth trusting.